Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. I'm Brian Page, founder of Modern Husbands. Sometimes our listeners want more support than a podcast can give, individual or couple support, which I now provide. Details can be found at modernhusbands.com, or you can email me at brian@modernhusbands.com. For today's podcast, we welcome Dr. Allison Daminger, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the author of What's on Her Mind, The Mental Workload of Family Life, forthcoming in September 2025. Daminger's research is focused on how and why gender shapes family dynamics, particularly the division of work and power in couples. Her award-winning scholarship has been featured in outlets including The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Psychology Today. Daminger also writes a weekly newsletter, the Daminger Dispatch, about the intersections between gender and family life. Today's discussion is laser-focused on the mental load and what's on the mind of working women. Enjoy the show. Dr. Daminger, I am really excited that you made it today. Excited to have this conversation because every man wants to know what's on her mind. There's even been a movie with Mel Gibson done on this. I know that I've been married for 23 years and I've been looking for the answer to the question, and you have it, and you've even written a book about it. So let's dive in and talk about it.
I'm so happy to be here, Brian. Thanks so much for the invitation. And yes, happy to reveal what is on her mind.
Well, let's start with the basics. What exactly is cognitive labor, and how is it different from other types of household labor?
Yeah, I've joked that academics love to invent new kinds of labor. There's, all sorts of different forms of labor that pop up in the academic literature. But I define cognitive labor or mental labor as a set of mental processes for keeping track of what family members need and what the family owes to other people beyond the household, and then making sure that those needs and obligations get fulfilled. And I started this research back in 2017 when I had been doing a lot of reading about decision making and how making decisions is mentally taxing. Right? You can probably imagine yourself at the end of a long week, and someone asks you, "Oh, what do you want to do this weekend?" And it's like, I don't know. I've been deciding things all week. Just tell me, right? And so I thought about how a lot of the existing research on household labor was really focused on things that you could see people doing physically, right? Sweeping floors, cooking meals, driving children somewhere. And I knew from talking with parents that they made a ton of decisions every day. And even non-parents as well were constantly bombarded with choices. And so I wondered, well, what would happen if we thought about decision making as a form of work? How would that change our understanding of what's required to run a household, and also of how of who does that work? And so my thinking about cognitive labor has expanded since then. I know we'll get into the kind of categories that I break it down into, but it really started with wanting to know, okay, how is decision making happening? What is it costing people, and how is that work distributed? Now, when I first started talking about this, the response I would get from a lot of people was, "Oh, you mean emotional labor?" I think at the time that was a more commonly understood term.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think of emotional labor as something that is related but quite distinct. So the original use of the term emotional labor was around managing your emotional response to be in line with what you thought was expected in a given space. So Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist who coined the term, talked about flight attendants who were trying to maintain, a smiley, cheerful, upbeat demeanor as part of their job. And in the home space, we aren't, being paid to smile, hopefully. But, when our children are, really annoying us, right? How do we keep ourselves from yelling when our spouse is complaining for the 10th time about their coworker, right? So those sorts of things are emotional labor. And that's different from the kind of planning and project management type stuff that would be filed under the cognitive labor as I talk about it.
So you break down the cognitive labor into 4 tasks in your book: anticipating, identifying, deciding, and monitoring. And before I get to my question, I have to say I loved your book. I should
Oh,
have
thank you so
led
much.
with that. But can you walk us through what those 4 tasks look like in everyday family life? So I'm going to say them again: anticipating, identifying, deciding, and monitoring.
Sure. So anticipating is about kind of scanning the horizon and figuring out what problems might arise, what needs are going to need to be filled. And I'll give you an example from my life. So I have a 3-month-old at home, my first child, and
Congratulations.
thank you. And when I got pregnant, I'd heard from a lot of people that finding childcare was hard and you had to plan ahead. So back, I think this was in my first trimester, I anticipated this need that someday, my husband and I are going to want to go back to work and we're going to need to find childcare, right? We need to start thinking about this before she's born. So then step 2 is identifying. That is scanning the landscape to try and figure out what options are available for meeting that need. So in our case, that involved putting together a lot of spreadsheet that outlined all the daycare centers in our area. We had cost comparison and driving distance. We talked to some friends to see which ones they recommended. And so it's kind of like a fact-finding mission where we just wanted to say, okay, what daycare centers might we reasonably send our child to? We don't want to drive, a long time in rush hour. We don't want to pay more than we can afford. And so we had this short list of possible daycare centers. And then we moved on to stage 3, which is decision making, right? Selecting among those options that we had just identified. And in our case, that required us to go and tour some centers, talk to other parents and get their advice. And ultimately, we didn't just decide on one. We kind of came up with a ranked list and said, okay, these are the 3 daycare centers that we'd be okay sending her to, and our favorite is this one. Let's really try hard to get off the wait list on that one. And then the monitoring stage is, a lot of these places are understaffed and overtaxed, and so we have to follow up
Mhm.
and say, hey, we signed up for the wait list 6 months ago. Are we still on there? Is there any timeline for when we might find out about whether she's got a spot? And continually following up until just a couple weeks ago, we got word that she's off the wait list for September and our top choice spot. So hopefully that has all gone to plan. But that's an example of a really long, drawn out, elaborate cognitive labor process. In other cases, it can be much simpler and straightforward. So it could be
Now,
something. Oh, go ahead.
before you get to that, I want to add a layer of complexity, because
Sure.
when we initially started talking, you made the distinction between the emotional labor that we have to tackle in managing the home or working, and cognitive labor. So the layer of complexity is that for people who perhaps don't have the financial resources to pay for childcare, or perhaps they don't have good paid paternity leave or maternity leave. Perhaps they know it's going to stretch them really thin. There is a emotional labor that comes with that every step of the way is going to make it more and more challenging. And depending on your own money story, some people handle that by just choosing not to do the research, to not tackle what they must tackle, because in their own mind, it's easier to like put it in the drawer and not think about it and not look at it. And then that adds to the problem, obviously. So I'm glad that you used that as an example, because those two things that are oftentimes kind of coupled together make it really hard to make decisions. They can cloud our judgment. They can make the cognitive labor difficult because the emotional labor that's tied to it is so draining. So anyhow, I
Yeah.
want to highlight that, and then I would love to hear a more simplistic explanation of, or not a simplistic explanation, an explanation of those 4 stages using something that's perhaps not as emotionally draining.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up because I think, we can talk about these processes in the abstract, but each family's situation is going to make it more or less complex. When you have limited financial means, then often the stakes are higher, right? If you don't get in off the one daycare center that is within, a reasonable driving distance that's affordable, then you are going to end up in a situation where you have care that you're not excited about, or care that requires you to pay more than you can comfortably afford, or care that requires you to drive across town at, challenging times. And it also adds that layer of stress, right? I think finding childcare is probably stressful in, all but the for the all but the very wealthy. But if you are dealing with that significant financial constraint, then yeah, I think the stress involved is going to make the labor feel a lot more burdensome. So thanks for bringing those points up. And then in terms of the sort of everyday example that's less emotionally laden, the one that I return to often is everybody's got to eat, right? Especially if you
Yeah.
have children who are not old enough to feed themselves. The need to feed your kids is going to come up every day, multiple times a day. And so anticipation is saying, okay, dinner is going to need to happen tonight, right? That is a need that our family will have to have some sort of food. Identification could be as simple as brainstorming, what do we have in the pantry and the fridge that could feasibly become a dinner that everybody would eat. It could be going through recipes you've got bookmarked in a cookbook or online, or it could be thinking through your favorite takeout places. All right, so just figuring out what are the different ways we might feed the family tonight. You make a decision. You say, all right, tonight, had a rough day. It's going to be takeout. I'm going to call my spouse and ask her to stop on the way home from work and pick up the pizza that everybody likes. Right. And then monitoring might mean following up with her. Right. It's 5 o'clock. She's leaving work. Shoot her a text and say, hey, just a reminder, you're going to pick up the pizza on the way home, right? Because if she forgets, then you've got to go to plan B, and that can lead to some hangry children and adults, which nobody wants. So that's an example of, this is the stuff that's built into the fabric of our everyday lives. And it doesn't need to involve spreadsheets or internet research or anything like that. Sometimes it's just happening in a few seconds inside our heads.
One of so if you back up in my life, like 15 years ago, I worked up to 80 hours a week. So my wife handled those types of things, despite the fact that I actually love to cook. And I took it for granted. I didn't understand the cognitive labor that went into, anticipating, what the kids need or what the family needs and when. I didn't take into consideration what was the second one here? Identifying the different options, deciding, what to cook and when, and then when you say, monitoring, like ultimately, does that mean like you're monitoring is a fridge full?
Yeah, do we have the ingredients we need, or do we need to, run to the grocery store? Are the kids, food preferences changing, and the meals that used to work are no longer going to work, and so we need to come up with a new set of family-friendly recipes, those sorts of things.
I read years ago Thinking Fast and Slow by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, and essentially, one of the things that he talked about is that most of the decisions that we make are kind of automatic, right? We're what is the term he used? Like basically, think of our mind as a pilot, and we're in autopilot for most of the choices. And if, let's say, like me right now, I'm responsible for all things cooking related, which I love. I'm kind of in autopilot because after a while, what people like, you have a rhythm, and it makes everything easier, right? So it really does come down to like it feels like that there's less cognitive labor because it's through habit. But whenever there's a disruption in that, there's stress. Like if I have family in from out of town, there's a disruption. So it's like, oh my, you literally have to go through all of those stages again and kind of reinvent the problem. Or we saw this following the pandemic when there was a global inflation price crisis, and the price of eggs was, $1 bajillion, whatever. And everyone's, flipping out. It's because like they could not have that typical grocery list for a similar price. Everything was so much more expensive. And when you have literally 40% of America living check to check, it created disruption. It wasn't just a financial disruption. It was a disruption in that cognitive process.
Absolutely. Yeah. When, I'm thinking of when the price of eggs skyrocketed and, families who, okay, breakfast every morning, we got to come up with a plan B because we
Yep.
can't afford to go through as many eggs as we normally do. You're, back to the drawing board. Or I'm also thinking of, a few years ago, I told my parents that, okay, I'm pescatarian, I'm not going to eat meat. And that sent my mother into a panic because all of the meals that she relies on include some form of meat. And
Yep.
so we now eat a lot more fish, and she's adjusted. And I think it's less stressful now. But that initial switch, as you're saying, can be really jarring.
One of my kids is a vegetarian, and another one has a nut allergy.
Oh
Now
boy,
wrap
yeah.
your mind around
Yeah.
those dietary restrictions and the menu offerings. I shouldn't say it menu offerings, but I take my cooking seriously. Anyway, all right. So one of your findings is that even in households that believe in equality, women tend to carry more of the mental load. Now, for our listeners, that's not always the case. That's not the case in my home right now, and that's strategic. So I'll just speak for our relationship because of where we are. I was the rose in the relationship, and she was the gardener, meaning that my career was the focus, and
Mhm.
so she was the one at home that was nourishing an environment to allow me to bloom in my career. But it's the reverse now, and so by design, I take on the mental load at home, and everybody's different in how they do that, but it's by design because of what we're trying to accomplish as a family to support her career. But when you look at the data, it's very clear that it's disproportionate, that women do carry more of the mental load, even when they're earning more, even when they are working longer hours outside of the home. So why is that? And how does it persist even with good intentions?
Yeah. So in my study, and my study is not necessarily a representative sample of all Americans, but just in this sample of about I think it's about 75 different sex couples. 80% of them, she did more or much more of the cognitive labor. So I have a chapter in the book for couples who fall into more of your current situation where he does as much or more than her, but you're right that that is the exception rather than the rule. And what initially puzzled me was because I would ask people to describe their ideal division of both cognitive and physical housework. And most people that I spoke to described something like 50-50 or close to 50-50 as their ideal. If I gave them a magic wand, they would want a division of labor that was a bit closer to 50-50. And many of them recognized that they weren't achieving it. So I sort of tried to figure out, well, okay, you want something more equal. You know that you're not quite reaching it. What enables you to sort of stay in that place? And what I found was that most people pointed to personality differences. They would say things like, she's type A, she's organized. They would say things like, oh, he's laid back, he takes things as they come, right? And so I call these two archetypes the superhuman and the bumbler. And in most different sex relationships that I interviewed folks in, she was described as the superhuman, and he was described as the bumbler. And so this narrative that that's just our personalities, I think allowed people to stay in patterns that they admitted weren't quite meeting their ideal. Now, what I find is that rather than personality, cognitive labor is much more about a set of skills, right? These are skills like, foresight, perspective memory, and these are skills that women, for a variety of reasons, tend to spend more time and energy developing. And they also tend to deploy the skills that they do have differently, right? Men tend to focus much of their mental energy on their professional and paid
Hmm.
work pursuits, whereas women feel like I need to save some of my brain power for the home,
Hmm.
right? I can't spend it all on the job and come home exhausted because it's my responsibility to make sure that the kids have what they need, that everybody gets where they're going. Whereas, a number of men in my sample would say, my job is just so draining, I've got nothing left when I come home. For women, they rarely saw that as an option. And this
Now,
is not,
before
oh, go
you
ahead.
move on, because I,
Yeah.
I don't want listeners to think, that's nonsense. Did you ever take a class when you were at Harvard with Dr. Golden?
I did not take a class with her, but I
Okay.
have interacted with her in different workshop settings.
Okay. So I had the honor of interviewing her last month. And for those of you who are unaware, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2023 for her work on the gender pay gap. And really what she found was that all things equal, it really comes down to greedy work, meaning that men are more likely to work longer hours outside of the home, and that in marriages, women are naturally filling the void at home, and that creates the dislocation in earning over periods of time. And so what you're saying is like spot on, not only with the research, but with Nobel Prize winning research. So I don't want people to dismiss the importance of what you just said. And then there's a second thing that you said about how you have I don't want to get it wrong. So you have the bumbler, and
The bumbler and the superhuman.
okay. So you might have listeners thinking, well, my wife is the superhuman. So in my relationship, she is the superhuman. That's the way she's built. But that doesn't mean that I can't be the superhuman at home. So let me give you an example. I still, I build my hours around what the family needs. So I work when I can, but I try to manage everything at home first. That's the priority. Now, does all of those things come as naturally as they would for her? No, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love to do it. And so how is it that we can still satisfy her need to want to do those things, because she is an organizer? Vacations. So
Mm,
when we go on vacation, like she was in like some sort of club in college where they organized events, and she loved it. And so, we agree on where we're going to go, but she loves doing it. And I'm not like saying this to get out of the work of planning vacations. She loves to do it. And for me, it's awesome because when we go on vacation, I don't even take my phone. So
nice.
she and I just follow the lead. We don't ever argue on vacation because we love to do the same things. She loves to be the leader. And for me, it's like, awesome. I'm just going to, chill out and follow the lead. So that's how we handle it. But we handle it in a way where it allows her to still prosper in her career. Right. So it's not an excuse for saying, well, since she's the superhuman, she should also be forced to be the superhuman at home. So anyhow.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've made really mindful choices. You've acknowledged, strengths and weaknesses, but you haven't viewed them as determining what you can do at home, right?
Right.
You sort
Right.
of recognize that some of these things come more quickly to her than to you, but you've practiced, you've put in the work, you've built systems that work for you, and so you're able to kind of work around, your preferences and et cetera.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the last point I wanted to make on this note is just that, sometimes when I talk about this finding, right, that men tend to describe themselves and their wives tend to describe themselves as, laid back and not super organized, um, it's not necessarily that they are slacking, right? Maybe in some cases. But I think that there are a number of social forces that make it easier for women to acquire the skills that are helpful in the domestic realm, especially when it comes to parenting, right? One of the things that I've noticed in my research is that a lot of parenting related resources and social groups around parenting are pretty woman centric or mom
Right.
centric.
Right.
And so it's women who are learning from other moms at pickup or other moms in the Facebook group about the best swim school, or the secret to dealing with this issue, right? It's less available to many men because of the ways that our social networks are structured. And that's just one of many examples. So I think it's, in some cases there are opportunities for men to step up, but in others there are a lot of forces working against them to keep couples in this more gender traditional division of cognitive work.
Particularly managers who don't, or just flat out misogynistic, who don't look at the two genders as equal, who the expectation is different for a woman than a man. So how do early childhood experiences shape the way men and women learn or don't learn to do cognitive labor?
Yeah, well, I should say that because my interview data focused more on adulthood, I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but I think that there's a few factors at play. When we think about gender socialization of young kids, one of the things that other research has turned up is that girls are socialized much more heavily to pay attention to how everyone else is doing, right? To pay attention when the family has guests over. Oh, can you get so and so a glass of water? Can you take so and so's coat? Right? You're socialized as a girl to make other people feel comfortable, and part of that is kind of constantly scanning to see what people need. Girls are also, I think, more celebrated for conscientiousness, right? If we think about the sort of stereotype of the girl with her planner and her notebooks and her organization. Those are characteristics that when parents see them in girls especially, they tend to kind of celebrate those. And I think they're less expected in boys, although I think and hope that that is shifting somewhat with
I
this
hope
new
so,
generation.
because that's such an important trait to
Yeah,
be successful in life.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other bit is that again, because social networks tend to be gender segregated. I think back to family extended family gatherings when I was growing up, and often the girls would be with the adult women, the boys would be with the adult men, and in those processes, you're exposed to different kinds of information. Right? I grew up. The adult women would be holding the babies and talking about babies and their needs. And I got to practice holding babies, right? My husband did not practice holding babies. He was not invited to, hold the infants at the extended family gathering. Um, so those sorts of things can be very subtle and small in isolation, but they all add up and accumulate over time to
Right.
send a message that, girls, the family is your responsibility. Other people's needs are your responsibility. And let me expose you to the different elements of family life that you're going to one day be responsible for. And I think boys get a whole different set of messages, right, that are much more focused on career and
Yep.
providing and those sorts of things that equip them for a very different role in the family ecosystem.
Listeners have told us that they love the ideas we share on our podcast to manage money in the home as a team, but want more help than one episode can provide. That's why I'm excited to announce On the Same Page Consulting for corporations, couples, and individuals. Visit modernhusbands.com and click Our Services at the top of the page to learn more about how I can help you or your employees manage money in the home as a team. Again, that's modernhusbands.com. Now back to the show. So one of the things that I found interesting in your book and in conversations is what happens with same-sex couples, same gender couples. What lessons can different gender couples learn from how cognitive labor is handled in those relationships and the relationships of same gender couples?
Yeah. So, what I found when I interviewed same sex couples about cognitive labor patterns was that inequality was present there. I think sometimes we have this, mistaken assumption that, oh, if you're the same gender, then everything's 50-50. And that's not what I saw. However, I did see that the inequalities tended to be less pronounced
Okay.
and they tended to be less distressing to the couples. And I think there are a few factors here. The first one is almost exactly what you were just saying is these couples were able to craft portfolios of responsibilities for each partner that didn't map neatly onto a woman role and a man role. Right? They would pick and choose. They would say,
Mm.
"Oh, you have a real capacity for numbers, and so you're going to be the finance person, but you also love to cook, and so you're going to be the cook in our family." They were much more of a sort of mix and match, and not wed to the bundle of responsibilities that typically goes with men in a different gender relationship, or the bundle of responsibilities that typically goes with a woman in a different gender relationship. Another factor was they talked much more openly with each other about these issues. So I often had the feeling when I was interviewing different sex couples that the interview was the first time that they were really wrapping their heads around some of these dynamics. And with queer couples, they would say, "Oh yeah, we talk about this all the time.
Mm.
My wife is this person, and I'm the this person." Right? And so in the process of talking about what their current patterns were, they also talked about how they felt about them, right? And whether they wanted to do anything differently. And that's the third factor that I think, is really important, is that most of these same-sex couples believed that they could change things if they wanted to, right? Whereas different sex couples tended to believe that this is just who we are, we're stuck, this is how it's got to be. Same-sex couples felt like, if this isn't working for us, we'll do something different. We'll find a way to do something different. And that sense that they had some control and leverage over their situation, I think helped them feel more content. Even though they didn't necessarily get to a perfect 50-50, it felt like this is something we are freely choosing and can change if we want to, which is not an attitude I saw a lot among different gender couples.
I wish I could just play that as a loop. I think that ultimately that is the rational, common sense approach to how every couple should manage the home. I'm glad you shared those things and took the time to research same-sex couples. Now let's start talking about solutions. What can couples do if they want to move forward a more equitable distribution of cognitive labor? Where should they start?
Yeah, so I think that an important baseline is to really get on the same page about what you're striving for as a team. I think that a lot of times there are assumptions baked in that haven't actually been addressed. It comes out when you're fighting or in conflict, but sitting down at a time when you're not in an argument, but just sort of saying, in our dream world, what would we be striving for? For some couples, 50-50 is the answer. And for other couples, it's no, actually, we think that it makes more sense for partner A to take on 75% of this work. So once you've kind of gotten on the same page about what you're striving for, when it comes to the division of not just cognitive labor, but physical labor at home, childcare, and also paid work, because I think we need to think about these as, they all are important parts of keeping a family running.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to think of them together rather than in isolation. So once you're on the same page about what you're going for, I think the next step is to really take stock of the status quo. What is each person currently doing? Now, with physical chores, that might be pretty easy to see. You probably know who cleans the bathroom each week and who cooks. With cognitive labor, that can be a little bit trickier. So one thing I have people do sometimes is keep a decision diary. Right? Decisions are often the most visible part of this process. And so you could experiment with, for I don't know, a day or a week, each of you just jot down the decisions you're making or thinking about on behalf of the family, and then come back together and compare notes, right? And you'll start to see, oh, okay, my partner tends to be doing a lot of the food-related cognitive work. I tend to be doing a lot of the, household maintenance-related cognitive work. And you can just assess, does this breakdown feel like it is close to your ideal, or is a lot more falling on one partner's plate? And if the answer is yes, one partner is doing a lot more than the other, and that's not what we want, then I think it's best to sort of start with the low-hanging fruit. Pick one area of life, so something like, the car or one particular something discrete. Right. So let's say that one partner is currently doing all of the food related work and that is stressing them out. Right. How can you start taking that off that partner's plate, putting it on the others? That might mean that you need to hand over full responsibility, right? It's not just tell me what you want and I'll get it from the grocery store. It's you're responsible for coming up with the meal idea. You're responsible for making sure that we have the right ingredients. You're responsible for making sure that it gets on the table at a reasonable time. And you're responsible for coming up with a backup plan if that doesn't go well for whatever reason. I think what often happens is that couples try to shift some of the physical labor, but they forget about the cognitive stuff that goes with it. And
Right.
so he takes on, he says, I'll cook on Mondays, but he hasn't necessarily come up with a meal idea. He
Yep.
hasn't put it on the grocery list. So really thinking through the steps that are involved and being clear about what those are and being clear that, okay, these are now being transferred to your plate. And if something goes wrong, you're responsible for figuring out a way out of it. I think you have to expect that there are going to be some growing pains.
Hmm.
Anytime you are disrupting, habits that have been ingrained over months or probably years, it's not going to go super smoothly. So I recommend picking something to start with that the sort of primary cognitive labor can live with going wrong, right? Starting with your kid's birthday party planning is
Mm,
probably not a good place to start.
right.
Whereas something that's, lower stakes, like if we have takeout 3 nights, in a row, it's not the end of the world. Is it the ideal? No, perhaps not. But that is relatively lower stakes and thus easier to kind of tolerate the growing pains associated with switching responsibilities.
That's a really great point. I had not considered the importance of selecting a low stakes task first. And I'm glad that you brought up owning the process from start to finish and the spouse who does not own that task anymore, giving them the freedom to do it their way as long as they agreed on the minimum standard of care. I'm a fair play facilitator and we
Yep.
call it CPE, conception, planning, execution, which is really similar to how you break it down. And when I work with clients and through this process, I have found the same challenges that you found, which are like frankly rational. Like my wife basically ran the house for 20 years, and of course she's going to have a way that she knows that works, and she doesn't want something to not work. So of course she's going to try to micromanage me. That's natural. That's going to happen in any type of function inside or outside the home. And it's hard to work through that and let go. Now, it's easy for me to sound sympathetic now because she's not over my shoulder telling me exactly how to do something. But that there are growing pains that come with that. But ultimately, it's certainly worth it. Um, Now, you write that many men want to help, and that is like clearly the case for the people that I interact with. Like, I rarely do I meet men that are like, I don't really want to help. That's not my thing. Like, I get it. They exist. I see them on social media. That's just not my circle of dudes. But many men do want to help, but they're unsure about how to jump in. And I've experienced this too, like asking, how can I help? And then my wife would respond with, this was years ago, something of like, oh, I got it. It's just easier to do it myself. And it was for her. So here I'm trying to help. And then she's telling me, I got it. It's easier. So from my vantage point, it's like, why are you being mean to me? That's kind of rude. So I'm just not going to ask anymore. And so there's this like silent resentment that builds, because the fact is, it is easier for my wife just to have completed it by herself. And it is easier for me to not ask, because then I don't have to deal with the silent treatment for the next 20 minutes to 4 days, depending on how I responded. So I think this is a really important question. You write that many men want to help but feel unsure about how to jump in. What advice do you have for those men to begin showing up better?
Yeah. Well, I think that What I saw in a lot of with a lot of the men that I interviewed for my book, that they would say things like, "I'm just not good at this stuff. She's just so much better at it than I am."
Mm,
Um, and I would challenge them to really question that belief. In some cases, I'm sure it may be true, but at least among the couples that I interviewed, often men had these skills that they were using in their paid work. And they just weren't necessarily seeing that the things that make me good at my day job could also make me really good at managing stuff at home. So I would encourage them to really think about, what do you do to manage your time at work? How do you stay on top of deadlines? How do you think ahead to what might be coming down the pike? And of course, not every job requires these sorts of things, but many, professional jobs do require you to be pretty organized, forward thinking, keep track of a lot of different moving parts. And so I would encourage you to think about how you make those things work at work, right? And then think about the parallels at home. The same skills apply, right? And so it might be that you do really well with, a daily to-do list that marks out what your tasks are. It might be that, you rely on your calendar. And so maybe you think about, how can I build checking the calendar at home into my daily routines, right? And so don't stop with the sense that I just can't do it. She's just better at it.
yeah.
Recognize that she's practiced probably a lot more than you have,
Right.
and that, you do find ways to use these skills in other areas of your life. So how can you think about transferring them in a way that might not be the same way as she does it, but that will work for you?
A tool that I found that was enlightening for men, that answers this question, and is to the preceding question about understanding, the how burdensome cognitive labor can be, how to quantify it, is an app called Persist. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with Persist?
No, I don't know this one.
So essentially, it takes 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most. You go through a series of 75 questions with your spouse, and actually, it didn't take us as long because we've been married for a while. So for younger couples, it might take longer because you've never had these conversations. But essentially, you respond to a series of questions, and then there are scales, and a lot of the questions have to do with cognitive labor. And so the what is what comes about at the conclusion of this, the result, are the amount of time that you exert on the cognitive labor that comes with managing a home. And I found it really helpful to look at that number, to see the graphics and the visualizations, because and other men are as well, because now you've got this visual where you realize, oh my God, like this invisible cognitive labor, it has a picture. So anyhow, for those of you who are unaware, Persist is a really great tool, and it makes it easier to have a better informed conversation about the cognitive labor when you can see right in front of you um, how much time it takes away from people. In the book, you describe how unequal cognitive labor can impact a woman's identity, stress levels, and even their career. Can you share a story or example that really stuck with you?
There are a lot to choose from here, but the one that comes to mind is, I interviewed a number of women who had really downgraded their aspirations for their careers,
Yeah.
because those ambitions, they felt, just weren't compatible with the heavy cognitive labor load that they were carrying at home. So I think of a woman who I call Sonia in the book, who had been, hopping from firm to firm because she was trying to find something family friendly, and her salary was sort of stagnating as a result. Or Cassie, who was an executive at a telecoms company, who felt like she couldn't, be the primary parent at home, and so she downgraded to a part of the practice that was a lot less lucrative, but also required fewer hours. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing. Like, I think that for many people, taking on less work, taking on more flexibility is great if that's what you want. Go for it. But what I saw is that a number of these women didn't even consider the possibility that they might ask their husband to take on that role and to step
Wow.
up. They just sort of assumed that this is something that I need to figure out a way to get done. And if it's not compatible with my career, then the career has to change. And so it just, it made me sad to think that they were cutting out lots of options that might have been ways to make it work. It reminds me a bit of the story that you shared about you and your wife, how you've really made a careful choice to say, okay, her career is going to be the priority in this season of our lives, and so we're going to make some shifts at home to make that possible. um, for whatever reason, most of the couples that I interviewed didn't contemplate that as a possibility, and as a result, women kind of changed what they were hoping for out of their careers to try and make things work.
Where can our listeners learn more about you and purchase your book? And I'm going to again recommend your book because I read it. I loved it.
Thanks, Brian. The best place to go is my website. It's allisondaminger.com. And there's links to pre-order the book, which is out in September. You can find more about my research, and you can sign up for my newsletter where I write about the intersection of gender and family life.
What is one piece of simple and actionable advice you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I would say, if you are listening to this and you haven't had a conversation recently with your partner about cognitive labor or the mental load or these issues, go home and ask them, right? How
Mm.
do you think we're doing on this stuff? I heard this podcast about it and it made me wonder. I feel like we're doing good, bad, okay. What do you think? Right? I think that if couples talk proactively about these issues, not just when they're in moments of conflict,
Mm.
they're going to be in a much better position to make thoughtful decisions rather than defaulting into, the gender traditional status quo, which often doesn't end up serving either of them as well as we might like.
What a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brian. It's been my pleasure.
Don't leave just yet. Be sure to like and subscribe before you do. And a reminder to visit modernhusbands.com if you're looking for money and home management support in your life. Just click the Our Services button at the top of the page. Again, that's at modernhusbands.com. And many thanks to our co hosts, our guests, and of course, all of you for joining today.